Hello, bonjour, Tashi Delek, and welcome to the first episode of the Canada-Tibet Committee Summer Speaker Series 2021. My name is Anvesh Jain, and I'm a current research associate with the Canada-Tibet Committee, hosting this discussion virtually from Calgary, Alberta. But you're not here for me. Joining us today is Mr. Samphe Lhalungpha, longtime board member and indeed now chair of the Canada-Tibet Committee. He was born in Darjeeling, India to Tibetan parents in 1950, before moving to New Delhi in 1956. Samphe has an honors bachelor's degree in government and politics from City University in the United Kingdom and a master's in public administration from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. He emigrated to Canada in 1974 and has since worked in journalism, public relations, and social advocacy. As his career developed, Samphe went on to serve in the Federal Public Service of Canada between 1987 and 1994 within the Public Service Commission, Agriculture Canada, and then moving on to the Canadian International Development Agency's Asia branch. Samphe is a 23-year veteran of the United Nations, working with UNICEF in Burma, Sudan, Laos, Bangladesh, Turkmenistan, and many others. At one point, he was charged with managing UNICEF's largest education program between 2006 and 2009, and he is blessed with a wealth of experience in NGO relations, development work, and education programming. Mr. Lhalungpa communicates well in English, Hindi, Nepali, and Tibetan with some knowledge of French, Arabic, Burmese, and Bengali. Thankfully, for my sake, this interview will be conducted entirely in English. Nowadays, Samphe has retired from his globe-trotting career to settle back down in Ottawa, and in his spare time, he enjoys cooking, horse riding, tennis, and catching up on his readings. Samphe, I hope you are keeping healthy and safe in these uncertain times. Thank you sincerely for agreeing to feature today as the first guest of our Canada-Tibet Committee Summer Speaker Series.
Thank you very much, Anvesh. And again, namaskar, Teshitele, and bonjour. Good to speak with you. Yep, so here I am.
Thank you very much. So we'll start off with an easy question. I know you're an avid collector of books on Tibet and the region of the Himalayas in general. What are you reading nowadays? And do you have any standout selections that you've had the chance to enjoy during the past few months of quarantine, which you'd like to share with our audience?
Oh, well, books. Yes, you've that's one of my weaknesses. I'm also quite omnivorous, though of late I've been catching up on a lot of my Tibet reading. I just want to say that when I was a child, I was very lucky. I was a little sickly and I stayed home a bit. And my father, who was a scholar and had a lot of books. And I remember reading as many of them as I could, even when I didn't quite understand them. And that's been a lifelong compulsion. So yeah, this some of the books that have kept me company and that I'm trying to read. There's a wonderful, I think, book by Tsiring Wangela. People know him as the editor. He ran for many years the review, Tibetan Review out of Delhi. I had the good fortune as a student in the UK. We were students together, not at the same university, but I knew him then, and a remarkable person. He's written a book of fiction in Tibetan in English, but it's a very interesting look at Dharamsala, a young person growing up in Dharamsala, working, he in that environment, milieu in the sort of mid-70s, and he captures beautifully that period and, just the way people were, the dynamics, and gives you an insight into how Tibetans were settling into India.
So moving on to the next question, you've had a long and distinguished career working with the Canadian International Development Agency and the United Nations on projects that have taken you, so many places. Haiti, Nigeria, South Sudan, Turkmenistan, Nepal, Burma. I can't even name all of the places that your career has taken you. And given your experience with development work in particular, I was wondering if you could offer some thoughts on how the Central Tibetan Administration, the government of the Tibetan exile community, tackles the question of development within the global Tibetan exile community. From your expert's perspective, what are some of the notable strengths and conversely some of the notable shortcomings that we've seen from successive CTA governments? And you can also mention the TSGs or Tibetan support groups in your analysis.
Well, I was 9 years old when we finally lost Tibet. And by the time I was 10 or 11, my father lived in Delhi and was very involved. He was the first Tibetan broadcaster, he and my mother, in All India Radio. In this, but at the same time, he also did a lot of what is now considered, I guess, relief work. He was in touch with many organizations, and because Tibetans were, all over the place settling. I mean, I think the situation for Tibetans in India, in a sense, India opened, the welcome door, and ultimately, land was made available in South India for Tibetans. So at that level of actually resettling, I think it's been quite successful in that way. It's not, people didn't stay long out of their work camps, Missimari, Buxan places. There's not this case like as in other refugee situations where people were 30, 40 years in a stockaded camp. So that, I think that allowed the Tibetans to be much more mobile. For instance, people used to leave the camps and do petty trade, especially the sweater business, and that took them all over India. So there was not, So that, I think, was very, very useful. Initially, the inputs to the Tibetan, I think, are relatively small when you look at global flows of resources, because so much was there. Where possible, Tibetans also used their own resources, whatever people had or brought with them. So I think it's been a success that way, because I remember the first kinds of work available in India for many Tibetans was the high altitude road building, because at that India was just coming to a realization then that the northern borders, now that with Tibet, even before that, but once Tibet fell, it brought the PLA right to the borders of India. And for the last 1,000 years, there was never a suggestion of any threat from the northern border. And suddenly, and so India was very ill prepared, to say the least. So the border roads were being built, and they couldn't find people to work at those altitudes except Tibetans. So actually, a lot of the early border roads were built by Tibetans with really pickaxe, crowbars, and dynamite. I mean, it's an enormous kind of saga. No one has yet written about it, but it's a heroic kind of work, difficult, remote, grueling. There were no bulldozers then up in those areas, no heavy machinery. So I think on the balance, that was that. I think the complexities, as Tibetan communities settled for longer, people got more settled, the schools were set up, I think people's aspirations also rose, actually, and which is natural and good. And I think that's been a little more challenging, is how to meet the aspirations of people. So, for instance, if you went to university and you went back to one of their settlements in the south, there was not a lot of outlets for your professional life, So you had to then select to either go to one of the metros, and there's a growing number of young Tibetans, educated young Tibetans in different in the metros, and that's, I think, been the latter day challenge.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective. Thank you for sharing. In the past, you've also facilitated multilingual education programs for the government of India. And piggybacking off of that, I was wondering what your views were on the state of education as handled by the Central Tibetan Administration, especially with regards to skills development and the teaching of the Tibetan language in schools chartered under the CTA?
I think, I mean, I again was, in 2019, I spent 8 weeks as a Tibet Corps volunteer in Dharamsala, and I was sort of embedded with the Department of Education and some wonderful colleagues there. One of the success stories of the CTA is the education. If you look for the resources that we have, for the inputs that we have, and I can tell you, even in India, for instance, the average Indian government primary school teacher, after the 5th and 6th pay commissions, depending on seniority and things, and mind you, this is with two years of college after high school, is making 40,000 rupees a month easily. And then if you have seniority and things, a lot more. So, the old story used to be that public school teachers weren't paid well in India, and so they weren't performing. Well, they are now, especially paid a lot better. Tibetan teachers, by that token, get 1/3, if that. Yeah. But our Tibetan teachers' attendance rates are so much higher, because we the sense of accountability to the community, the sense of, even with the kind of salaries and everything else paid. So, and in education, if the teacher doesn't show up, then that's a huge input missing. You can have the best building in the world, or you can have all the best books. So on that basis, so I think, and Tibetan students are doing better and better, and many are toppers and things. Although I think just looking at the people who do get the best marks also it skews the system. But that, at the moment, that's the kind of cultural environment in which we, and you and I were educated in India. We know this this thing of topper mentality to some extent. Again, the challenges, I think, happen with success. So a very interesting thing, I did focus groups with a couple of about in 5 schools over 12 days, with both children from grade 3 to 6, and then 7 to 11, and a couple of different groups. Did about 10 of them. What's so interesting is, when you ask those people now, this is in 2019, what do you want to be? The range of things that children wanted to be was so much bigger than what it used to be. In the old days, in the 60s, 70s, the girls would say, we want to be nurses. The teachers, quite a few would say teacher. And then the boys would say, we're off to join the army, because that time, there was the Force 22 thing. And 1 or 2 others, but that was kind of the sense of possibilities. And now, I mean, I don't have my notes here, but I remember I remarked to the, we had surgeons, accountants, actors, really 1 or 2 pilots, which meant that the young people and children were exposed to a larger menu of possibilities. And also what had happened was India had changed. The options in India had changed for everyone. So, so that was one of my sense. So I think the challenges will be with some level of success comes higher expectations. Also, the communities are, if you live in the metros, then you normally would then send your child to a school in the metro, and there are not that many Tibetan schools in the metros. So, there are some of those challenges, but they're essentially, to some extent, the challenges of a level of success. There were some very interesting programs. The one, USAID had been helping with early grade reading, ensuring that children are able to read early on and it's sort of being run almost like a movement. And so the little reading corners, and there were, and then the other thing is there weren't that such a quantum of books for children to read in Tibetan, and you need quantum, you need density if you want to promote that. And so the department and are also creating lots of children's literature. And there is a growing movement outside, both in, I think, in Tibet to some extent, also in in the diaspora to do this, because the recognition is that without that, you won't build a linguistic foundation.
As well, which is that as somewhat of a community historian, as I can tell both by your loquation skills as well as your bookshelf, I think you can offer a very privileged insight into the functioning and evolution of Tibetan life under exile. This is doubly true since you've witnessed so much of this evolution firsthand, whether it was in India, Canada, Nepal, or elsewhere. So what are some of your observations? How do you think that the Tibet exile community has grown and matured since the initial invasion of 1959?
Well, the thing is, I don't think I want to just be very clear. I can't speak for anybody else's experiences. I had a fairly unique set of experiences because my father came out of Tibet in 1947, sent by the government of Tibet as a very young official to look after and make sure that the Tibetan children, largely from the official classes then, who were sent to places like North Point and St. Paul's, did not lose their language. So his official title was officer in charge of students, and he had a 3-year contract to come out to India and do that. That's how come I grew up. I was born in, and he met my mother, who's from Darjeeling side, and then after 51, because after Chamdo fell, then the whole equation changed a little bit. So so I grew up in India, but I grew up in a very Tibetan milieu. We constantly, there was back and forth from Tibet, letters, people were coming. There was all the talk in the house, all the people, but 59 was, our version of the catastrophe. Then it was really, even as children, the whole environment changed, and then people came in distress, and the whole ground had been swept away. Until then, people,
a rupture in time, almost.
Yeah, and people thought, we used to talk as children. I remember the lady who looked after us would say to us, "Hey, you're not from here, you're from there," pointing to the mountains. And we were 6 and 7, maybe even younger. So this sense that a home was there across the mountains. Well, that all went for down the tubes because the whole terrain and scenario changed. I think Tibetans have one thing, we're very resilient people, extremely adaptable. Anywhere you take it. I'll tell you a story. Years ago, so I traveled with this group of people who belonged to a dance drama group. It was from the Amdo community, amazing people. And I was 11, 12. And we went to Chandigarh from Delhi by train, 3rd class, of course, and then everyone piles into the thing. They had a whole strategy. The train came, they just rush in, they got places to put all that. Because don't forget, they're not only carrying their own bedding and things, they're also carrying all the props. Okay, but they're all going to understand. There were the young men who moved this, the women who moved that, somebody looked after the kids, and cooking utensils and everything. So I remember when we got, was it Chandigarh? The station? Oh no, we got to an intermediate station to change trains. Then everyone got there, they piled their luggage in a certain way. And then by this time, somebody's already gone to the market. They brought vegetables and some meat, and somebody made a fire somewhere, enormous. And then in no time, everybody had a bowl of really hot steaming tukpa. I mean, incredible, and part of that, I think, comes to the fact that in our history, not everyone, but we had this kind of nomadic travel kind of culture. So the ability to make something of the situation, and it is very much, I think, part of who we are. So, and in India, you can see, I told you with the sweater wallas, and then you can go the length and breadth of India, and some Tibetans been around, been there, and to this day, the sweater trade goes on in a different form now, doing more markets and things. There is a growing group in the metros, and you'll see them in the high-end restaurant business, chefs, the restaurant managers. You'll see them IT business, and other areas of endeavor also. There is, I think, some level of underemployment too, because come out, they're not quite sure what they do. But so, and then in the West, we've had the Swiss community who are settling in well, and in the US, huge Tibetan community, very mixed. It has its own dynamics, and now we have Toronto. I mean, when I first came to Canada, we were less than a couple of hundred Tibetans in all of Canada, and today the equations has changed to the point where we have somebody in the Ontario legislature who's Tibetan by origin. Obviously, she represents all her constituents. A remarkable person. Butila Karpoche, but there she is. And there are other young people coming up and entering some form of public life and things. So I think the direction of travel is a good one if we keep this momentum. Yeah.
100%, and you even have a little Tibet now over in Parkdale.
That's right. Yeah.
And speaking of emigration, you actually yourself emigrated to Canada to join your parents here all the way back in 1974. For the past very many years, you've been involved in some capacity with the Canada-Tibet Committee before taking up your current position as chair. And in the 1990s, you even helped organize the visit of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Ottawa. Tell us about your journey to Tibet advocacy.
Well, growing up in the kind of family I did, it was very natural. He was advocating all the time, very active. He was a very early patriot to the group. In fact, it's those who do the history know, there were 5, 6, 7 of them in Kalimpong in the mid-50s. So, it was a natural progression. So it's not like we decided we'll do advocacy. And when I came to Ottawa in '76, I came to study journalism here or take the journalism course. I was the only Tibetan then, so whatever it was, if there was something happened in Montreal, there was very active and still then community. And Carol and Thukman, who basically got the CTC going, we cooperated, and I did, I sort of willy-nilly became the guy in Ottawa, and of course there are other people who helped, obviously. But again, the equations change so greatly now with the numbers of Tibetans coming to Canada. And what's also different, I think, is in early part of people were lobbying the government of Canada fundamentally to some extent as foreigners, of course, obviously, and then asking, could we get this and that? Today, I think when we see, and especially younger people going to lobby, and we approach the Parliament and the MPs as prospective, as citizens, as voters, because the things that we're asking for are not contrary to Canadian values, and nor are they contrary actually to the interests of Canada as a democratic country of a certain size, based in the Western Hemisphere. So that's a shift. It's a generational thing, I think. But with younger people, I know, And at least I myself, once I became citizen, I decided I'm not going to go to parliament, with a cap in hand in the same way. One has a democratic right to go and advocate, to go and reach out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think I look at some of the more successful communities in this country one of the Sikh community, you have to really hand it to the Sikhs. The kind of, mind you, there's the quantum of people, but the social organization around the Gurdwaras and the other group that's really successful in advocacy and also, with a certain profile in Canada are the Ismailis. Ismailis are so well organized, obviously very well resourced, but then it's a nature of the composition of the group. And I remember I was when the Ismailis came from Uganda because Idi Amin drove them out. Yeah, and so the UK got a bunch. Some went to India, not many. Then some went, and then Canada and the US, and today the Ismailis are highly respected. They've carved a place of, they don't. If you go to their events, you'll see so many young Ismaili women, highly educated for things. It's a nice way to counter the notion that Muslims don't educate their girls, but they do it in a very quiet, way. So I think that we have certain groups, and also they're very active, and as Canadians too, obviously. So yeah.
So that's it seems like you were always kind of destined to fall into the Tibet advocacy.
Well, if the thing is, I don't know. I never met my grandfather from Tibet. I never met my uncle, and I did get to Lhasa once, and I met my aunt, who by that time was very old, very quite ill, but quite a character. She had become a nun, and she was living very poorly, willfully, because as she said, I said, "Auntie, can I buy you some better blankets and pots and pans?" She said, no, I don't want anything. She said, whatever we had, they took away, and now I don't want anything that they can take away. This way, I have nothing they can take. It was very sad, but at the same time, what a resolute woman, So I think of people, these kinds of people, and the courage of the Tibetans in Tibet. Right across, if you look, the social organization, the capacity to actually resist in all kinds of ways, to cooperate, but to make sure that it's for the good of the communities. And what they're up against is an inexorable kind of force. I don't think we begin to understand the kind of state power that is being deployed against Tibetans now. People, the Uyghurs, the Tibetans were faced at every level of state power. People go on about
the tenacity in the face of such odds is absolutely courageous.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. When every parameter, every component of your life is under attack, your very identity. And in Mao Zedong's time, the Tibetans were considered white hat, black hat. If you had the wrong class background, then you were given a black hat. But then others who didn't, at least weren't suspect for them, from a class basis. But that's when they were practicing that kind of a Marxism. Now that they're way beyond that, I think today they're much more just being Tibetan is enough of a provocation. Or for the Uyghurs, just being Uyghur Muslim is a provocation. That's a very different condition. That's a very different state of being, and I think, so in a sense, it's an existential assault, because in the end, it's the thing is not to. It reminds me a bit of what they said with the residential schools. They have sent the residential schools to beat the Indian out of them.
Mhm.
It's exactly what the Communist Party of China would like to do to nations. This is what we never must
Yeah,
forget.
I think the exact phrase was to kill the Indian in the child.
That's right. So this is what I think we're seeing, but with augmented by artificial intelligence, overwhelming force. If you look at the distribution of the military in Tibet, Chinese People's Liberation Army, their rocket forces, parts of their their long-range missile forces, then they have their border guards, then they have their second line, it's just mind-boggling, and that's not all. And then they have the People's Armed Police, that is their kind of, Gestapo, sort of, I consider them, like it's more than paramilitary, and they're the ones that, I'll tell you one image that stays in my mind. When the 12 days I was in Lhasa, every day there's a quora. Tibetans go, clockwise around the Pagor, and it's a lovely thing, and people come out, and old and young, and at 3:30 every day, a completely armed patrol of these cops, mostly they're from Shetwan. They are locked and loaded, padding, everything. They're carrying shotguns, automatic weapons, batons, sprays, and their march counterclockwise. It's a deliberate insult to tell us we're here and we don't give a damn about your conventions. And that's very clever, they'll just move aside and these guys move, and then it's like a river, and then they collect after them. So it's these kind of not so petty humiliations to that telegraph, what the intentions are.
Yeah, it's a psychological kind
So when all of that is happening, I think it's those of us who live overseas, what little voice we have, it behooves us. It's not for us. We're sitting here in Canada, in India, we have an expression in Tibetan about freedom. It's sort of like comes from the Hindi word kush, the kushi lumba. We're in a land where we can do our thing. So if we're in kushi lumba, but our brothers, our cousins, they're not, and sisters and others. So that has to, I think, at least be within every person consciousness,
and
so whatever we're doing, or I can do little, it's nothing extraordinary and nothing special. The people who are special are the people who live in Tibet.
Well said. But I don't think I think what you do is very special and extraordinary as well. 4 decades, bringing it back to Canada now. How has the perception of Tibet issues changed within Canada itself? And what kind of new strategies or approaches can supporters of the Tibetan movement in Canada employ to better advocate for the cause?
Well, actually, it's really interesting. Canada, when I first came here, and Canada itself as a middle power, and also one of the existential issues with Canada always was located so close to the United States. You kind of are there, and you also have to then define yourself a little differently. And definitely, by the time Pierre Trudeau was, he definitely was of a mind that we ought to be rowing in different. So Canada did not participate in the Vietnam War, and that kind of strategic activities of the United States, and of course. By the same token, Canada was very open. It was a different China. It was a China that was isolated, self-isolation, obviously first, isolated, and they were, not part of the world discourse in any way there. So, and Canadian missionaries had played a very active role in China. And then there were other social activists, and there was the famous Dr. Norman Bethune, who was, if you read any of the Red Book and things, he shows up as a foreign friend who was there during the Civil War and helped the Red Army a great deal. So there was a large trove of goodwill, I think, for China, not for the extreme policies, because don't forget, Canadian troops fought in Korea, and Korea, by the end of, at the beginning it was North Koreans, by the end of it, more than 300,000, 500,000 Chinese troops came, and so Canadians actually had to face off against this onslaught. So it's not all kumbaya, but I think there's definitely a civil society, a sense of goodwill, and China was seen as something far away. People were trying hard. The party was trying, and especially by the 80s, the Cultural Revolution was a bit of a desert period, I think, and people. But after that, and then the first tours went. Canada opened diplomatic relations. So when we came, some people, especially that time on the center and the left, would say, I've had even one or two journalists say to me, you're all supported by the CIA, and you're a conspiracy against China, which is a up and coming and a poor country, and you're a that's changed completely. I think now there's a recognition, and it's a different China today. I mean, it's a we've never been historically in this situation where even the Soviet Union at its height was a military power, but it was not an economic power. And it was not part of the global economy. It had its own Warsaw Pact, trade, and all of that within it. We today have a quote-unquote authoritarian communist state that is also a globalized economy and part of the global financial systems, take part in it, benefit. So this is new terrain, that we're in. And so of late, and I think if you look at the data from some of the surveys, the trust for the PRC and CPC is down in the low 15% now. That's now. But this is not to say there aren't, the issue is not whether people are for or against China. The issue is, are you for the values you hold and to help promote and defend them? That's one. And two, as Tibetans, we're not asking that this country adopt a warlike stance or something. This is not, we're not after that. But I think we need what I call a realistic, all-weather thing. So where the party transgresses, I mean, for instance, there are 2 or more Canadians currently held hostage. I mean, I think that's the word to use. They're held hostage, and so we find ourselves in a very peculiar situation. If what do we do as a democratic entity? And I would say that you've got to fess up with other countries and approach together and say, if you continue to do this to us, we have people here in Canada who of Chinese origin who perhaps in jail and things because of various things that go on. So I'm not, I'm not in the security business, but I think it's time for all parties to have what I call a 24/7 Canada stance, and but with friends, because we see what they're doing to Australia now. That Australia stood up, because once they can isolate a country, they're pretty, because they're goal driven. I mean, it's very simple. I mean, Xi has already proclaimed the China Dreams. It was the 100th anniversary of the CPC this last couple of weeks. They've been, and they've already outlined that for 2049, which will be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PRC, they want to, by this time, have become the dominant superpower. Now, there are no straight line extrapolations, and people have come to grief with that. You can't project. What I say is that the intent is there, some of the means are there, and so what does it mean for us?
Yeah,
so
and I think one of the worrying things is determining how much of this is rhetoric and how much of this are they willing to put into practice.
Well, if I look at, let's look pragmatically. If on the border, in the Tibet-India border, where they have to defend their interests, they're very vigorous, and especially if they have, so the South China Sea, but also, they also have a soft projection. They see all Chinese communities abroad as being their territory, if you like, in a way that their and so that's where we can come in collision with them, and so I think again, one has to be awake. I think we His Holiness has enunciated so clearly, as Buddhists, we do not proclaim, we do not want to see any kind of global conflict around these issues and things. There's a huge difference between, global conflict and not drawing not having some capacity so that when they make a calculation, they factor in the fact that you can resist in many different ways. I mean, I'm talking about civil resistance, other things too, and then of course more kinetic kinds of energy. But as the CTC, but the CTC is not a strategic think tank. But we are, fundamentally there to support this, the policy plank of CT articulated initially by His Holiness on seeking meaningful autonomy for Tibet. My only take on this is that meaningful autonomy does not mean giving up. It's not. It's I maintain, and perhaps I'm deluded, that you can fight for meaningful autonomy with very hard-nosed way. In fact, you have to. If anyone's ever negotiated with the PRC, they know if you're not hard-nosed, they are. And so I think, and what are those parameters? What are the bottom lines? What are the non-negotiables? I mean, I'm not the government, I can't say these things, but speaking as a private person, and I think in my rights as a Tibetan, the one conditionality that the CPC makes, apparently, is that before any negotiations, we have to admit that Tibet was always a part of China. Well, this is completely flies in the face of historical reality. It's wrong. It's not historically correct. And I don't think I wouldn't walk into any place with that kind of, proposition, and even to articulate that statement. I mean, there are Chinese historians who don't believe that 100%. So how can we participate in what is fundamentally a fabricated lie of the CPC? So what I'm saying is, because among Tibetan, especially younger Tibetans, and there's a feeling, oh my God, these guys for the middle way are going to give up the shop. But I think you can be pretty hard-nosed. That's why, for me, the middle way, Rangzef, independence, they're all part of the spectrum of what I call resistance. You resist culturally, you resist artistically, you resist socially, and so I think I'm not a binary dichotomous kind of person. And again, I think it's important for us Tibetans to keep that suppleness of mind,
It's It's a fantastic way of putting it. You mentioned one interesting question earlier, and it almost word for word, it was something that Lester B. Pearson, when he was Secretary of State for External Affairs back in Ottawa in the 1950s, there's an internal document from 1950 or 1951 from around the invasion, and he asked the exact same question, which is, if Tibet was a part of China, then why would you send an army to go fight against people who are supposedly part of your own country? It doesn't make any sense.
Well, you know, I mean, there are so many things between, and especially, I mean, if we don't want to go into deep history, between 1911 and 1951. So in 40, you know, when China, during World War II, I mean, their war started earlier. The Japanese invaded by 1936. They were in, for the Allies to support China, they wanted to build a road first from Burma, but then Burma fell. Then they, in fact, in the mid 40s, Captain Tolstoy and Brooke Dolan was sent by Roosevelt to Lhasa. That time there was a regent, to basically request the Tibetans if they could build a road across Tibet, because being flat, it was back in, and then it was Sichuan. It was right there, much easier, and the Tibetan greeted them well, gave them all the diplomatic courtesies and things, but they said basically, look, in this war we're neutral. Tibet is neutral. Tibet's a Buddhist country, and we, so while we wish you all well, we cannot participate in this war, and this road would be an act of war. So the road was never built, and then the Americans had to resort to that air bridge called the Hump, in which hundreds of American airmen lost their lives because it was vicious flying over the mountains into Chongqing. So, at that time, if we were part of China, that road would, that lifeline would have been built, but it wasn't, and even Mr. Roosevelt and his little gifts couldn't persuade, the Tibetan government to accede to this request.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a history buff. You and I could talk about 20th century history all day, but let's move on to our final question, a little bit of 21st century current history, current affairs.
Yeah.
Canada-China relationship has been in the news lately with the hostile detention of the two Michaels, as you mentioned, the upcoming Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics, as well as the growing concerns surrounding foreign interference and the dubious origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. With the bilateral relationship arguably at its all-time low, and with the Canadian government and parliamentarians looking to reassess this relationship in particular, where do you see Tibet fitting into these considerations, and what role could the Tibet issue or Tibetan Canadians potentially play in this brewing conflict moving forwards?
Well, for part of the conflict is happening because of the way that the Communist Party does its own business, and the way it decides to deal with countries like Canada and entities within Canada. So I think, as I said earlier, I think Canada's middle income country needs to, I think, join up, let's say, with the Brits and the Aussies and others, to see if and to some extent the EU, but the EU is terribly risk averse in this area at times, and so that there can be a common approach. So if because I think the one thing the government of China understands is that something that they perceive as a threat and can be delivered, for instance. The other thing is not to forget that we keep talking about, the markets, but the Chinese want also, access to our markets, and even in certain access with the growing middle class and a consuming class in China, they want visa access. There are lots of tools that one can, I think, deploy to send messages. So that's that. As I say, we need to have the discussions going on in Parliament on the China relations things, but a serious 24/7 policy, and it's not going to be one or two things, Um, and I think it'll also, when at the moment it seems like we're dealing with one large entity, but are there any actors in that country that could be reached, be a little bit, to have a different conversation with? I don't know. I mean, some countries you can do that. There are independent universities, agencies, but in the PRC, I think where especially in the Z, the reach of the party, I mean, is so tremendous. So but I think to me, that's the first thing, is to get something solid, so that there are lines that the Chinese have, that PRC has a sense, if you do this, that, on Tibet, I think if we want to interlocute with China, right now, they're not in listening mood, as you know. And in the past, we had a sense that Canada could be more a country they might be more, open to, because we're not a strategic threat. Yeah, we're not a strategic competitor. But now I think that mood, that kind of thing, I'm not sure that obtains anymore. One, as I said, coming back to the area where they want to be seen as good actors. So I think now we want to look also in the international. Recently, they've taken up multilateralism in a big way, partly because the Americans dropped the ball under Trump on that purposely. You notice how they quickly went and claimed that space. So that they're very opportunistic that way. But I think they don't realize that this multilateralism then entails obligations under international law, laws that treaties they've signed up to but have not really delivered on. Innocuous sounding things, for instance, like very few people know that the Convention on the Rights of the Child was one of the most widely ratified conventions. If you unpack it, and I do, I worked for UNICEF for 23 years, and this is what we transacted. All of the rights that we talk about for adults can be found in some shape or form there. Language, participation, right not to be imprisoned unjust, things like that. Governments signed that because people like to, nobody blinked. They signed thinking, oh, this is about children. But children are up to 18 years old. Yeah. And so I think there are pathways there to get hold of them, and on language, definitely, maternal mother tongue, on a series of things, that's one set. Now they've also taken on the SDGs, so we've unpacked the SDGs and see what, where I think on environment also they're vulnerable, although they're posing as huge green champions. When you look at the actual practices, the fact that they're still enormous emitters of coal-fired energy and things like that. So there are areas in which, if that's the terrain they want to be judged by, if that's what they want to dominate, the multilateral thing, I think that then we also look for so where can we then chip away at that, and get some. The whole idea is not only to win an argument. The whole idea is to make sure that they then mitigate or blunt their practices in Tibet, so that it starts to less affect Tibetans, or to benefit Tibetans. So I think while China, we're in the situation where the Canada's working out its new relationship with China. The other way is also, we are going through something around our First Nations, and I think by example, I mean, this is something that if this country can start in the next 2 to 3 years to show that we can integrate the First Nations into our constitution, if they have standing in the constitution, if we can abrogate, if we can give, replace take the Indian Act out with all its complexity. I mean, it's a huge job, but it has to be done. And then the status, the whole thing of different, the relationship with the crown, and interlocute on a whole different set of terms, almost to some extent, nation to nation within the country. I think that example can be very powerful,
Yeah, leading by the power of our example rather than the
that's right.
Power.
Yeah, and I mean, already Canada, globally, I think it's a very complex polity, as you know. We're one of the few countries in the world where we have a confederal system, where, for instance, how we accommodated the aspirations of Quebec as a nation and a people to preserve their language. Things, Quebec has a range of devolved authority that other provinces don't, in recognition of this. So now it's not all smooth sailing, and there are rough patches, but it's something we're transacting. You'll never get that in the United States because their constitution doesn't have the space. It's a different kind of a setup. So I think that when we can have this example, with this kind of examples, but we can't go there only with preaching. If you just preach, example is much more powerful, I think, because everyone can. Preaching is easy, we can all preach, but action, example. So I mean, so in that way, just by being advancing this agenda of reconciliation, this is very critical too, I think. And now we are well past the stage, I think, where just words and wringing our hands matter. Now we're looking, at real progress, and then I think we can look the PRC right in the face and say, listen, we're doing this in our country. I mean, New Zealand, to some extent, it's a tiny country, but they've taken it further, and that's very useful. Then when we stand for certain rights, we say, listen, we know we've done this. We're doing this in our own country. We're doing this even though it's painful at times. We're doing this because it's the right thing to do, So, and then, one never banks on anything, but, we used to think, I think the great conceit was thinking that once the Chinese adopted a form of market economy, they would also adopt the democratic side. I think that was wishful thinking on the West. And so we have to be much more pragmatic now. They're not going to break out into parliamentary democracy tomorrow. Yeah, but they doesn't have to. But they could moderate the system within the logic of their own system in ways that are less onerous on their citizens and on Tibetans and on Uyghurs. Lots of this cranking up is political administrative. So they it's not either or. They can actually let some oxygen in.
Yeah, thank you. Those were some very fantastic answers. And before I wrap up here, I do want to offer you some space to, if you want to provide any concluding thoughts or any final statements.
Well, I don't know. I'm pragmatic. I don't have any big advice on things. I think we have to start doing stuff now. So, as I said, my beliefs are in analysis and in modest actions. And in some level of taking things forward by doing and being very open-minded. I think in our history in Tibet, we've had all kinds of things. We had our empire in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries in Central Asia, but we've also had some remarkable leaders, and one of them is this minister Sonsan Gampo, Thomi Sambota. And there's a wonderful story told of how he went to Beijing and, of course, got the better of the court and the ministers there because he was very clever, and very smart. And of course, they didn't expect him to be, so they always underestimated him. Oops, sorry. That's true. So I think we should all, we should put on our Thomi Sambota hats now. It's
Absolutely.
जो होगा वो अकल से होगा. I don't know.
Exactly. Yes. And to translate again for our English audience, that just means whatever happens, do it smartly. Do it with your knowledge.
Oh.
So, Samphe Lhat, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It was truly an enlightening and long conversation on your career and thoughts on the past and the future of the global Tibet movement. And I certainly learned quite a bit.
Well, as I say, I have no great flashes of wisdom or insight. I just, it's what I know I learned by doing. And of course, the other thing to realize is that circumstances change and what you learn changes. So when the day I stop learning, I should leave talking.
I think you're selling yourself a little bit short, but I wish you all the very best in your retired life, and my wishes for your health and wellness. I look forward to your future appearances for us here on the Canada Tibet Committee. And for our dedicated viewers, make sure you tune in again in the coming weeks and months for future episodes of the Canada Tibet Committee Summer Speaker Series 2021. We've got a variety of interesting and exciting guests coming up exclusively for your benefit. Thanks again. Be sure to follow us on our social media channels for more interviews, media releases, and reporting on all things Canada and Tibet. This is Anvesh Jain, signing off on behalf of the Canada Tibet Committee. Bodh Yaro.